Welcome to Conspiracy Tapes by Skoob, where we dive deep into the murky waters of American power structures that most people never see. I'm your host, Ryan Martin, and today we're tackling one of the most controversial topics of our time, the deep state. Now, before you roll your eyes and reach for that tinfoil hat joke, let me stop you right there. What we're about to explore isn't some basement conspiracy theory cooked up by internet trolls. This is about real institutional power, real policy decisions, and real consequences that affect every single American, whether you realize it or not. So, buckle up, because we're about to peel back the curtain on a story that's been decades in the making. Let's start with a simple question that's probably been bugging you. What exactly is the deep state? Here's the thing. If you're afraid to bring this up at dinner parties because you don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, you're not alone. The term itself has become so loaded, so politically charged that many people dismiss it outright. But that's a mistake. The concept of a deep state isn't new, and it didn't start in America. Historically, we've used this term to describe foreign governments controlled by proxy officials. Think military leaders pulling strings behind the scenes in places like Venezuela or Egypt. Classic examples of shadow control. But then came 2017, and suddenly Americans started hearing about our deep state. And here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just some fringe theory anymore. We're talking about a network of government officials at every level, from intelligence analysts sitting in windowless offices to agency directors with corner offices and mahogany desks, all working with goals that don't necessarily align with their agency's stated missions. Their unstated objective? To stop, slow down, or otherwise throw a wrench into whatever the elected administration is trying to accomplish. Take former CIA Director John Brennan's remarkable statement in 2017. He actually said that executive branch officials have an obligation to refuse to carry out any order they deem unpatriotic or undemocratic. Think about that for a moment. Who decides what's unpatriotic, what's undemocratic? That's a pretty significant amount of interpretative power being claimed by unelected officials. And then there's James Comey, the former FBI director who, shortly after being fired in 2017, decided to leak sensitive information about his meetings with the president directly to the press. Not through official channels, not through oversight committees, straight to journalists. But here's the plot twist that'll really bake your noodle. The political sides have completely swapped on this issue. For the last 2 decades before Trump, it was primarily left-wing voices talking about deep state actors. They claimed that shadow figures within our government were responsible for 9/11, that it was a manufactured disaster designed to kickstart Middle Eastern wars for the benefit of the military-industrial complex. The idea that there are people who believed our own government would kill 3,000 fellow Americans just to justify war is chilling. But that was the conspiracy theory du jour on the left for years. Then Donald Trump became president, and suddenly everything flipped. The same people who had spent years warning about unelected political influencers now started viewing these very same forces as a necessary check on a disruptive president. Meanwhile, the right, who had previously dismissed deep state theories, suddenly found themselves pointing at the same institutional actors the left had been warning about for decades. Now, let's clear up a crucial misconception. When we talk about deep states, we're not talking about conspiracies in the traditional sense. This distinction is absolutely critical to understanding what's really happening. Picture this. Conspiracies are like guerrilla fighters. They're individuals, conspirators, working in the shadows, pooling their personal resources, connections, and influence to subvert the establishment. Think Guy Fawkes trying to blow up Parliament in 1605, or John Wilkes Booth assassinating Lincoln. These people were risking everything, betting their lives on overthrowing the system. Deep states are completely different animals. They are the establishment. They're not trying to overthrow anything. They're trying to control it from within. It's like the difference between a revolution and a hostile corporate takeover. Here's an analogy that makes it crystal clear. With bacon and eggs, the chicken was involved, but the pig was committed. Conspirators are the pig. They're risking everything, betting their lives. Deep state actors are the chicken. They're contributing to the cause, but they're not making the ultimate sacrifice. They're using institutional resources, not personal ones. When a general fights a war, he's not spending his own money on bullets and tanks. He's using the army's resources. If he loses, he might get fired, but the institution continues. The army marches on. Deep states are essentially institutional cancer. The military, judiciary, intelligence agencies, all the organs that are supposed to serve the state, have gone rogue. Instead of serving the state, they make the state serve them. Over time, they execute what amounts to an internal coup, becoming a state within a state that shapes policy without regard for elected leadership or citizen concerns. These rogue institutions literally hijack the nation from within the government's own structure. They don't need to storm the palace gates. They already hold the keys. September 11th, 2001 changed everything. Or did it? Here's what really happened. While everyone was focused on the visible changes, the checkpoints, the Jersey walls, the ninja-suited security squads turning Washington, D.C. into something resembling Cold War East Berlin, the real transformation was happening behind the scenes. And it was massive. The Department of Defense's 2005 base realignment and closure process perfectly illustrates the absurdity. Brass was supposedly designed to reduce excess military infrastructure. Instead, Fort Belvoir, just 15 miles south of D.C., ended up with 30,000 more personnel. So much for dispersal and security through distribution. But here's the fascinating part. Tourists seemed to love it. Watching these heavily armed security details, seeing the fortress-like checkpoints, experiencing the dramatic tension. It was like being inside a Tom Clancy novel or an episode of 24. People found it reassuring to be considered worthy of all that security theater. This tells us something profound about American psychology and how we've been conditioned to accept increasingly intrusive government oversight. The slow, incremental rise of what we now recognize as deep state power didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without our passive acquiescence. The post-9/11 expansion created something unprecedented in American history. A parallel government structure that operates regardless of who wins elections. There's the visible United States government, the neoclassical buildings around the mall, the ceremonies, the press conferences, and then there's this shadowy, indefinable system that doesn't appear in civics textbooks. The visible government is like the tip of an iceberg. It's theoretically controllable through elections. But the subsurface part, that operates on its own compass heading, pursuing its own agenda regardless of who's formally in power. Now, we come to perhaps the most shocking revelation in this entire story, the sheer scale of privatized intelligence operations that emerged after 9/11. Get ready for some numbers that'll blow your mind. According to a Washington Post investigation called Top Secret America, there are now 854,000 contract personnel with top-secret clearances. That's more than the number of cleared civilian employees of the government itself. We've literally outsourced our national security apparatus to private companies. Since 9/11, 33 facilities for top-secret intelligence have been built or are under construction, Combined, they occupy almost 3 Pentagons worth of floor space, about 17 million square feet. And here's the kicker. 70% of the intelligence community's budget goes to paying contracts with private companies. This isn't just about money, it's about power and influence. The membrane between government and industry has become so permeable it's practically non-existent. James Clapper, former Director of National Intelligence, was an executive at Booz Allen Hamilton, the government's largest intelligence contractor. His predecessor, Admiral Mike McConnell, became vice chairman of the same company. Booz Allen is virtually 100% dependent on government business, yet it's owned by the Carlyle Group, a private equity firm managing $189 billion in assets. Think about that dynamic for a moment. A private company, owned by investors seeking maximum returns, controlling vast portions of America's intelligence operations. These contractors increasingly set the political and social tone of Washington. They're shaping the direction of the entire country, but they're doing it quietly. Their activities aren't recorded in the Congressional Record or the Federal Register. They're rarely subject to congressional hearings. They operate in the accountability-free zone while wielding enormous influence over national policy. The really insidious part? Wall Street serves as the ultimate puppet master in this arrangement, supplying the cash that keeps the political machine running smoothly. When politicians forget their lines and threaten the status quo, Wall Street floods the town with cash and lawyers to help them remember where their real interests lie. It's not hyperbole to suggest that Wall Street may be the ultimate owner of the deep state, if only because it has the money to reward government operatives with second careers that are lucrative beyond imagination, certainly beyond the dreams of a government salary. Enter Donald Trump, and suddenly the deep state narrative went from background hum to front-page headlines. The Trump administration didn't just acknowledge deep state theories, it pushed high-tech conspiracy thinking into absolute overdrive. Trump repeatedly accused U.S. intelligence agencies of being part of a coordinated effort to undermine his presidency at every turn. Trump used the phrase deep state constantly, accused the FBI of spying on his campaign without providing evidence, and made the extraordinary claim that he trusted Vladimir Putin's denials about election interference more than his own intelligence agency's assessments. Let that sink in. An American president saying he trusted the Russian president over American intelligence professionals. The conspiracy theory rhetoric became a daily occurrence. On a single day, May 10, 2020, Trump posted nearly 100 conspiracy-oriented tweets, including multiple references to something he called Obamagate, which he claimed makes Watergate look small-time, and was the biggest political crime in American history, by far. When asked by a Washington Post reporter to specify exactly what crime had been committed, Trump's response was telling. Obamagate, it's been going on for a long time, and from what I understand, that's only the beginning. Some terrible things happened, and it should never be allowed to happen in our country again. Vague, sinister, but utterly lacking in specifics. As former CIA historian Nicholas Dujmovic observed, the president's own rhetoric, more than any other factor, fans the flames of deep state thinking. And those flames spread like wildfire. A 2017 Washington Post ABC News poll found that nearly half of all Americans, 48%, believed that a deep state of military, intelligence, and government officials who try to secretly manipulate government policy actually exists. Only 35% thought it was an unfounded conspiracy theory. By 2019, an Economist YouGov poll found that 51% of Americans had heard of the deep state. Among Republicans who were familiar with the concept, 83% believed it was actively working to overthrow President Trump. Even 10% of Democrats thought it might be trying to remove him. But the real test came during the 2020 presidential election, when Trump's conspiracy theories threatened the peaceful transfer of power for the first time in American history. Despite losing both the Electoral College and popular vote by substantial margins, Trump refused to concede, insisting without evidence that the election had been rigged. The culmination of this conspiracy thinking played out on January 6, 2021, when Trump supporters, convinced that shadowy forces had stolen the election, attacked the U.S. Capitol building while Congress was certifying the results. Here's where the rubber meets the road. How do these deep state structures actually override elected leaders and their policies? The pattern is remarkably consistent and frustratingly predictable. Candidates campaign on one set of policies, win elections, take office, and then somehow end up pursuing entirely different agendas, even when those original policies were popular with voters. Take Barack Obama. He ran for president in 2008 largely on a platform critical of George W. Bush's military interventionism. Obama promised a different approach, a more diplomatic stance, a reduction in American military involvement overseas. His supporters were energized by this vision of change. But something fascinating happened shortly after Obama took office. He seemed to abandon his idealistic campaign promises in favor of drone strikes and sending troops into conflicts around the globe. The very military interventionism he had criticized became a hallmark of his presidency. Then came Donald Trump, who also campaigned against the war in Afghanistan. He criticized endless wars, promised to bring troops home, and pledged to focus on America first. His supporters cheered this message. Yet both Obama and Trump ended up expanding the Afghanistan war shortly after taking office. How does this happen? How do two presidents from opposite political parties, elected on similar anti-war platforms, end up pursuing identical pro-war policies? This is the deep state override in action. It's not about conspiracies or shadowy figures in smoke-filled rooms. It's about institutional momentum, entrenched interests, and the simple reality that permanent government structures have their own priorities that transcend election cycles. The military establishment, intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and foreign policy apparatus form an interconnected web of institutional interests. When a new president arrives with disruptive ideas, this web activates to preserve the status quo. Sometimes it's through briefings that emphasize certain threats while downplaying others. Sometimes it's through carefully curated intelligence reports. Sometimes it's through the simple weight of institutional expertise telling the newcomer why their campaign promises won't work in the real world. The result is always the same. Campaign promises fade, and institutional priorities prevail. Now, let's talk about a deep state component that most people never see coming: Silicon Valley. When we think about the military-industrial complex, we typically picture defense contractors building tanks and fighter jets. But the modern deep state runs on technology, surveillance systems, communication networks, data analysis platforms, and artificial intelligence. Silicon Valley, broadly defined to include not just software and hardware companies, but the entire telecommunications infrastructure that makes our connected world possible, has become absolutely vital to deep state operations. We're talking about global surveillance technology, but also the avionics, sensors, and guidance systems in every plane, ship, tank, missile, and drone the military purchases. One former NSA insider revealed that spy agencies are completely dependent on Silicon Valley's technology, communications backbones, and cooperation to even begin performing their missions. Think about that. Our intelligence apparatus literally cannot function without private technology companies. This creates a fascinating power dynamic. These tech companies aren't just government contractors. They're essential partners in the surveillance state. And unlike traditional defense contractors who were obviously part of the military establishment, Silicon Valley maintains this image of innovative disruption and democratic values. Yet, behind the scenes, they're providing the technological foundation for unprecedented government surveillance capabilities. Your smartphone, your social media platforms, your internet searches, your digital communications, all of it flows through systems that can be, and are being, accessed by government agencies. The genius of this arrangement is its invisibility. When most people think about government overreach, they picture obvious symbols like police or military personnel. They don't think about the algorithms sorting their data or the corporate servers storing their personal information. This Silicon Valley integration represents perhaps the most sophisticated evolution of deep state power. It's not just government agencies operating in secret, it's the seamless merger of government intelligence capabilities with private sector innovation and resources. The result is a surveillance and influence apparatus that would make previous generations of authoritarians weep with envy, all wrapped in the friendly interface of apps and platforms that people voluntarily use every day. We can't discuss modern deep state narratives without addressing the elephant in the room: QAnon and its relationship to mainstream political discourse. Now, this is where things get really complicated, because QAnon takes legitimate concerns about institutional power and wraps them in layers of fantastical conspiracy theories. But here's what's fascinating. The core QAnon narrative about shadowy government figures working against elected officials isn't actually that different from what we've been discussing. The evidence suggests that Trump was, at minimum, well-versed in QAnon theories, despite his public denials. The pattern of his social media activity, the similarity between his statements and Q posts, the coded language and references, it's hard to deny that there was some level of awareness, if not coordination. From characterizing Democrats as snakes trying to destroy everything, to claiming COVID-19 was a hoax, Trump's rhetoric consistently echoed themes that appeared in QAnon posts. The question isn't whether there was awareness. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is about the nature and extent of any coordination. What's particularly insidious is how QAnon took legitimate questions about institutional power and wrapped them in increasingly bizarre theories about satanic cabals and child trafficking rings. This had the effect of discrediting valid concerns about deep state overreach by associating them with obviously false conspiracy theories. It's a classic disinformation technique. Take a real issue, surround it with obvious lies, and then dismiss anyone who raises the real issue as a conspiracy theorist. Whether this was intentional or just an emergent property of online conspiracy culture, the effect was the same. Legitimate discussions about institutional accountability became nearly impossible to have in polite society. This is exactly how deep state power protects itself. By allowing the conversation to be dominated by easily debunked conspiracy theories, the real institutional actors continue operating without scrutiny. While everyone's arguing about whether politicians are secretly lizard people, defense contractors are writing policy, and intelligence agencies are expanding their surveillance powers. Let's talk about Congress, supposedly the branch of government that's meant to provide oversight and accountability. In theory, our elected representatives should be the check on executive power and institutional overreach. In practice, most of Congress is only intermittently aware of deep state operations, and when they are made aware, they usually submit after a few well-chosen words from institutional emissaries. Here's how it actually works. There's the full Congress, 518 members who spend most of their time on partisan theater and electoral politics. And then there's what amounts to a rump, Congress consisting of leadership and some members of defense and intelligence committees. This smaller group gets the real briefings, makes the actual decisions, and maintains the relationships with institutional power centers. The rest of Congress is essentially kept in the dark, fed talking points and public relations materials instead of substantive information about what government agencies are actually doing. When regular Congress members do stumble onto something significant, they're quickly brought into line through a combination of classification restrictions, political pressure, and appeals to national security. The message is always the same. This is too complex and too dangerous for public debate. Trust the experts. Trust the institutions. The result is that our supposedly democratic oversight system has been effectively neutralized. The people who are supposed to be asking hard questions and demanding accountability instead become rubber stamps for institutional priorities. And when real oversight does occasionally happen, when someone like Edward Snowden reveals the scope of domestic surveillance, or when documents emerge showing intelligence agencies misleading Congress, the response isn't reform. It's damage control, prosecution of whistleblowers, and renewed efforts to prevent similar revelations. The system has become self-protecting, with each component covering for the others in an intricate web of mutual interest and shared secrecy. So, where does this leave us? What we've uncovered isn't a shadowy cabal or a movie-style conspiracy. It's a system. A web of institutions, incentives, and power structures that grew quietly, steadily, and often without real consent. The deep state isn't about secret meetings. It's about what happens when systems outgrow democratic control and accountability fades. And here's the unsettling part. This didn't happen overnight. And it didn't happen without our silence. Every compromise we ignored, every revelation we shrugged off, helped this system entrench itself further. But the real danger isn't just surveillance or influence. It's what happens when trust collapses and conspiracy fills the gap. History shows us that's how democracies unravel. The shadow is still there. The only question is whether we confront it in time or keep looking away. If you want to go deeper into what's really operating behind the curtain, download the Skoob app now to access the full story, extended analysis, and episodes you won't hear anywhere else. Until next time, keep questioning, because the most powerful truths are often hiding in plain sight.